evenings, very often, there was, again, ring, shout, singing that would go on. And one of the songs that they would sing was "Oh Freedom." Oh, freedom, the will. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. And they would sing it around the fire as they kept their strength going, right? No more shouting, no more whipping, no more beating over me. They talked about their experience, the negative experience, and then they turned around and said, but before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home. Go home to Canada, go home to Africa, right? There was this whole movement taking Africans back to Africa during that time, right? Go somewhere and be free.
I think I've said all I need to say about the hypocrisy within the Southern system. I mean, this was huge. It also created cognitive dissonance within the Southern population and difficulties in the governance of the South. It introduced race where class should have been, and so forth and so on. This has been tough for America. I mean, we are living through what I hope are the last phases of this hypocrisy. I hope they're the last phases of it. But this hypocrisy is at the heart of the American self-concept. And it is the problem that when you create a group of slaves and you exclude them from your civil society, you exclude them from having an ordinary range of human relationships, you exclude them from the economy, what you have then done is to collapse what is possible for those people who are included. And you also force some of those people who are included to be part of the oppressive force. That's what it is. You force them to be complicit in the oppression. And that then creates a cognitive dissonance in them if they have any heart at all. And so at the heart of the American Republic has always been this problem of slavery and now segregation. And perhaps we are at the end of it.
So one of the key pieces that happens when you start to sing this music is brain coherence. Sections of the brain start to work together better. Now, for a long time in neuroscience, we thought that when you didn't use a nerve, it got pruned, and that was the end of that. You were out of luck. You were dead in the water. But what happens now is we find that the brain will do remapping. And if you sing the music, it can remap. And if you've been singing the music consistently, then the brain is already working better. It's already used more of the brain. It's already engaged from the front of the brain all the way to the back, all the way to the oldest parts of the brain. So, did we lose the connection? We did. There it is. I may have too. So auditory neurons don't resonate in a linear fashion. Different kinds of sound impact the brain differently, and tonal cognition is very, very key. What's unique in this music is that the person who's standing next to me in a congregational setting is probably not singing the same part that I am. And they may not be much of a singer. And they may not be really, really good at holding the rhythm. And so the fact that they're singing a little bit of dissonance, and maybe a different part, and maybe a different rhythm on one side of me and the other, produces a setup where my brain has to work harder, and my brain has to listen better. And so that relationship of tonal cognition, understanding the sound and beginning to tune your brain to the sound, actually takes one side of your cortex and links it to the other. For years and years and years, we thought that there were no cross-cortex linkages. We could not have been more wrong. And this music links those two sides of the brain. The other thing it does is, because somebody over here is singing a very slightly different beat from somebody over here, congregational setting does that. Okay, that's a normal part of the process when somebody comes in and has more training in music than somebody else. Well, it produces a process that's a pseudo-binaural beat. Now, binaural beat is actually kind of cool stuff. One, it increases brain coherence. Two, it produces altered states. Three, because it produces brain coherence, it allows you to think at different levels. So when you connect into yourself and you connect into the divine, you're thinking at different frequency rates. And when you're thinking about the trauma that you had and then the direction to clear the trauma, there is a path and a process in the words of this music in order to clear the trauma and move to a new and a higher place, a better place, a more complete place, a place where you are seen and you are whole. Then that allows your whole body to make that shift. So the act of congregational singing and the rhythmic structure that was present and the arcs of sound that would move through whatever space people were singing in actually allowed the brain to make another step forward and make that step so that the brain could function better. If you're more plastic, you can adapt. If you're more plastic, you recognize trouble when it's coming. If you're more plastic, you're able to do things faster, better, stronger, more powerfully. It makes your brain work better. Key piece in that process is that cortex of the brain. Absolutely key. And the linkages that come. All right, so the next thing that it does is you've got this population that's under horrific stress. And it's terrifying. You never know when you're going to get hit. You never know when you're going to get tortured. You never know when you're going to get raped. This is for men and women. This is for children. And there was no power that you had to stop it. Well, brain coherence states actually allow you to take and down-regulate your limbic system. Your limbic system is your emotional system. And if you are taking and de-stressing so that you're not always in hyperdrive, which is part of what's happening to our soldiers, okay? They're in hyperdrive and they don't know how to come back down. Then you store the information differently and you're not going to trigger. That's number one. You're also going to reduce your anxiety. If you're not so stressed, you can perceive more accurately. If you're not so stressed, you're going to survive longer because you're not going to fry out the serotonin in your brain and the dopamine in your brain that you have to survive. Serotonin is key because it controls how your heart beats. Dopamine is key. These are two neurotransmitters in your brain because it controls smooth muscle movement. You had to be able to work. You had to be able to have your heart beat effectively. So if you could use this music, down-regulate your system, and be able to function better, then you could make your body work in the way that you needed it to.
That oral tradition that was part of African history, the griot of Africa that maintains the history of the community, of the tribe, etc., was brought over here. So that the African who is creating these spirituals is not writing them down, okay, and documenting them. They got documented subsequent to their creation, basically. But one of the things that one does, I've often told the story that I'm not much of a cook. I mean, I've never been much of a cook, I get the bean out of boiling egg. And you get addicted in European and American culture to reading what to do. But what happened in the African tradition is that there was this storytelling that is a part of their lives. And there's no book full of better stories than the Bible, right? And so there was, those stories were told in various settings, and then they were transformed into the spirituals. And so Jacob's Ladder was the story of Jacob. And they in fact told lots of stories of those strong prophets of the New Testament, right? As a way of affirming the strength that was needed to persevere, okay? And so Jacob's Ladder is something that, again, has the simplicity of strophic, the simplicity of repetition, right? So that everyone can participate, and so take a breath. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. Soldiers of the cross. Every round goes higher, higher, telling a story. Every round goes higher, drawing a picture, right? Every round goes higher, higher. Soldiers of the cross.
Okay, the theology that develops, the liberation theology, develops out of the spiritual. And it develops out of the spiritual because it's not just an academic theological exercise. It doesn't come out of the schools of theology. It comes out of the lived experience of the slaves. And the funny thing happened on the way to the Civil War. God actually did what Genesis says God is supposed to do. There is in the spiritual, there is in the black culture this tremendous faith in God because God came through. That is to say, the promise was met. And that fact then of the force of black music that went all around the world after liberation is part of what leads to the liberation movements everywhere. The theological development is that we actually do think that it is the highest thing to look after the least of these. That is a huge breakthrough. And that's not about economic rationality. That's about love in action. That's about a radical love in action. I'm not a theologian, okay? But I understand what it comes right out of the spiritual.
Very few things grow brain tissue. If you are a championship meditator, and you are a championship meditator in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, twice a day, every day, for 20 years, you're going to grow some gray matter in the Raphael nuclei, which is back in here. Short of that, you gotta sing. It's really, really simple. When you look at musicians, and you look at tuners in particular, you look at people who are singing regularly, you know? And this could be the person who's singing in their choir, who's singing in the community chorus. This person is actually growing their gray matter volume. That's critical. How many people know somebody who has Alzheimer's out there? Okay? Pretty much everybody in the room. How many people know somebody who is having some sort of memory loss that may not be associated to Alzheimer's? Those of us that are over 55? Okay. Goes with the process. Well, it turns out when you're a musician, your hippocampus, your parahippocampal gyrus, your superior temporal gyrus, all of these really cool areas that do your cognitive processing grow. It's good for your brain. It's beautiful, beautiful stuff. And it's all down in there, right? Tucked up underneath. That gray matter grows. And it links really, really critically because it links back into the vagus nerve system. Now, when you're in a situation where the people around you are doing really weird stuff, and they used to do things like an overseer would be told, we need to make sure that we have control. So they would pick someone, even though everybody was out doing the work they were supposed to be doing, they would pick someone, and they would beat them deliberately to keep people terrorized. Because if they could keep them terrorized and keep them depressed, they could keep them in control. Well, if you could feel when that was coming, you could keep your head down and maybe not get beat. Now that's very, very important. The recognition of cognitive dissonance means that when you're walking down the street in a city and somebody's coming behind you and gonna mug you, you have a sense of it. That cognitive awareness of something's about to go really weird. How many people have had that experience in their life? When they just know that something in their life is gonna go really weird. Okay? That really weird factor, that discernment, being able to recognize those moments, in part comes from the singing training. Well, that's a critical factor in the process. If you have not got the ability to recognize a mismatch, and you're looking in the frontal lobes, the occipital lobes, and the temporal lobes. These are areas where you do imagination, where you do cognitive processing, where you link the ability to do math and the ability to envision a better world. Okay? If you can't recognize when things are out of whack, you can't change them. So singing allows you to recognize it's wrong. And it allows you to say, I'm going to do something about it. And here, because I've tuned my temporal lobe, I can come up with a creative solution. So our musical training is teaching our children to solve our world's problems. And it's not like the world doesn't need some help.